Welcome to the Events Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Taylor, and each week I talk with event entrepreneurs about how they plan, promote, and run their events. We help you build your events empire by growing your business using live events. Whether you're running community meetups, conferences, trade shows, IT training, music events, or literally any type of event, we focus on finding actionable tips that you can use straight away. The podcast is sponsored by appsevents. We produce over 300 of our own events across the globe every year, from training to conferences, and we're now sharing our expertise to a small group of event professionals. There's a couple of ways we can help you. Firstly, we can run the logistics for your event. We have a whole support team who can handle all the heavy lifting for you. We can help set up your website and agenda, liaise with your speakers, deal with the huge volume of questions you'll get from attendees. We can liaise with venues, and we can come to the event to actually run it for you on the ground. Get in touch with James at appsevents.com and we'll jump on a call to see if we can help. Secondly, I offer one-on-one coaching to help event entrepreneurs grow their events. I want you to get more attendees, produce epic events, make more money, and most importantly, to do it all with no stress. So just email me at dan@appsevents.com and we'll jump on a call. And now, on to the interview. Hello and welcome to the Events Podcast. Today I'm delighted to have Steve Monnington back on for the third time. I think maybe a record, maybe the most anyone's been on the podcast. So welcome back, Steve.
Thank you. I wish it was under more positive circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. So Steve runs Mayfield Merger Associates. He's involved in buying and selling large events and knows a lot about conferences, events, trade shows, exhibitions in general. So great to have Steve back. We're in the middle of COVID nightmare now. We're recording this on the 6th of May, 2020. So depending on where you are in the world, there's some positive signs. But yeah, we're definitely in the middle of the biggest crisis I've ever known. I haven't been involved in this industry for that many years, but I'm sure, Steve, it's the biggest crisis or issue you've ever seen with the live events industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only issue in my many years of experience that has actually meant that the entire industry has ground to a halt. It's completely unprecedented. And I think that people's approach to it is differing from company to company simply because nobody really has any previous track record of this type of issue. It's just something that people can't get their heads around.
Yeah, and I want to talk about how this all started. I mean, you mentioned to start off with you've got some thoughts about how you've seen this whole mergers and acquisitions thing. So if you want to kick off with that, then we can talk into how this all started, when we started hearing about it, and how it all got started really, from our point of view.
I mean, I guess that people started to become aware of this, around the end of January, beginning of February, when the news was coming out of China, and we were working on a buy-side project for one of the larger organisers, looking at potential acquisitions in China. And the Chinese authorities moved relatively quickly once it was out once people had become aware of it worldwide, to close down the industry in China. And that kind of caught us a little bit on the hop, because you ask yourself, how can you actually talk to organisers about buying their businesses when those shows are being cancelled? And nobody at that stage, I mean, it's well documented what the West felt about what was happening in China and how localised they felt it was. So people obviously continued to run shows until they were told that they couldn't run them. Yep. So throughout February and the beginning of March, people were still planning to run their events, and it was only around the very beginning of March when we started talking about no large-scale events, that companies had to make a decision before the lockdown was announced as to whether they would chance it and run their show, or whether they would actually pull it and then in terms of then think about the circumstances in which they would pull it and either cancel or postpone. there were some organisers who were talking to their exhibitors constantly, and there were a number of shows which were actually closed down during build-up. So one of my good friends, Tom Hetherington, who runs the Northern Restaurant and Bar Show at the beginning of March, actually pulled his event on the first day of build-up.
Wow.
So it was a very stressful time for the large organisers. And some organisers made a decision to go ahead regardless, and I think that backfired on them.
In what way?
Because they had much lower visitor numbers because people were starting to be worried about going. They had quite a big dropout of exhibitors because people didn't want to travel, didn't want to be involved in the events. And actually, I think that those events that went ahead, in that first week or so of March, significantly damaged their brand value because the exhibitors saw it as a cynical attempt to get out of refunding money by actually holding the show. So there was that, coupled with the fact that the shows were smaller, lots of empty spaces because exhibitors didn't come, relatively quiet because visitors didn't come. So I think those that pulled their events around that time in that grey area talked to their exhibitors one-to-one, pushed the shows back to September and the fourth quarter, which at the time they felt that was a safe period, were the ones who got really good, reputational upticks from their industry because they were seen to be putting their community, their exhibitors first. So this then, so there was this kind of grey period. Yeah.
Do these people? Did any of these event producers have to still pay for the venue and still pay a lot of these costs? Because obviously we'll talk at some point about people who the kind of financial disaster that some people may are going to be in. Like, did any people get on the hook still to pay for venues and things like that?
So obviously the people who ran the shows did. And the people who didn't run the shows went into discussions with the venues, and the venues, there was not a coordinated approach by venues because there are obviously associations of venues, but this was something which everybody was reacting to differently, and we created a group of independent organisers. A club, if you like, that which was scheduled to have meetups. Obviously, we can't now. Called the Event Entrepreneurs Club, and we've got around about 70 members or so. And in those early days, we held calls with. We kept the numbers down, so they were more intimate calls of 6 organisers at a time to discuss what was happening at that time. And one of the key discussion points was how different venues were reacting to them financially in terms of contractual issues and whether they were making them pay or not. And there were some venues which were outliers. So most of the venues were playing ball. They were moving people's dates without any cost implications for that, which then allowed those organisers to say to their exhibitors, we're postponing the show for 6 months and we'll just move the show, and what you've paid for is good to go and you don't have to pay any more money. There were some venues at the time who were trying to stick to the contractual rates and say, if you want to book for the venue in quarter 4, then you're going to have to pay again, but we'll give you a 10% discount. And that, of course, caused a lot of problems. And those venues, who I don't particularly want to name, came round because they came under pressure from the independent organisers and from the big organisers when people were able to compare and contrast what different venues were doing. And ultimately, I'm pleased to say that all of the venues saw sense and realised that they couldn't charge people again. And obviously, when the lockdown came and they were forced to cancel the events, then they had absolutely no choice but to say we'll reschedule it for you, and there won't be any further costs. And of course, the organizer then has all of the money that they need to pay to the contractors, which are generally paid after the event. So the contractors, have also had to move everything forward and not take any money now. So you kind of get this top-down issue where everybody is having to defer the revenue, if you like, and it's causing a lot of issues with a lot of the independent suppliers, and of course the independent freelancers and consultants to the industry. There's a whole great network of those who have got major cash flow problems. Fortunately, then, particularly if you consider the UK, because I can't really talk about what has happened in every country because it's different, but in the UK, the government then introduced the furlough scheme, which has given a lot of people some breathing space by putting their staff on hold, and the government end up paying a large proportion of the staff costs. But even in today's press, they're talking about the fact that can't last forever, and they're going to start changing that to encourage people to get back to work. But our industry, I think, is going to be one of the last to get back to work. So, we've still got these severe financial impacts around us, and will have for some time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you mentioned the financial aspects. Obviously, the event producers, the suppliers, obviously the owners of the venues, everybody. Do you think? I mean, we'll get on to later about the future, but do you think there's going to be people that don't make it and just look for another line of business? And or are you already seeing it, or do you think most or all are going to make it through and keep running their events? I mean, how do you see it like at this point?
So, if you take the organisers first. There are some organisers who have probably expanded. I mean, if you talk about the big guys, people like Informa, they announced quite early on a rights issue to raise £1 billion to offset part of this, and there's been speculation that some of the other big organisers are doing the same. So those publicly quoted companies are able to go to the market and get their investors to give them cash. The independents, the smaller independents, obviously don't have that resource. Most of them that we talk to have told me that even if they don't run any events this year, they will be okay. And what most of them are doing when they've got events which lend themselves to digital elements is that they've increased that. They're doing a lot of online seminars. They're getting sponsorship for those because there is still quite a lot of money around, and the revenue from that is covering their cost base. So they're not going to make the profit that they would make if they were holding a physical event, but what they're doing has enabled them to cover off their overheads to survive this year, or until they can run their next show. I think the two tricky areas for organisers, if we talk about them first, is so some of the early stage organisers who are in their growth phase and haven't really got the cash flow from the past behind them to provide any kind of buffer, are in trouble right now. And there are a number of discussions going on trying to get people to invest in those businesses, which is difficult for people to do at the moment while things are so unclear. So I do expect some of those to not survive. I think organisers of large public events, consumer shows, have got major difficulties because their shows don't lend themselves as well to the digital presence, and therefore the money that comes from that. Whereas the trade show organisers who were going to run shows in the first half of the year have collected money from the exhibitors, which they've then held over until next year. The consumer show organisers don't have that buffer because a lot of their income comes from ticket sales. So I would expect some of the consumer show organisers not to survive. And then it becomes a question for the trade show organisers of how long this is going to go on and when they're going to be able to start to run events. And obviously, the longer it goes on, the more susceptible some of these people are going to be to cash flow issues and ultimate closure. So I don't expect to see everybody survive, unfortunately, which is one of the most painful parts of this as you look at it. What I do expect to see when we've got more visibility about events starting to take place, I expect to see quite an uptick in people partnering, independents partnering with larger organisers in a kind of joint venture way to get some security. In terms of the mergers and acquisition processes, as you mentioned, that's our core business. And for all of the businesses where we were working on selling, those were just all put on hold by the. What was interesting is that the major organisers who were buying these businesses didn't say that they were pulling out. They just said they needed to put them on ice until things were clearer. So I think we're going to get a reasonable amount of fallout. But if we can get events away sooner rather than later, most of the independents that we talk to will survive.
Yeah, there's a few things to talk about there. The first one is virtual events. Now, if we take us, we're in a smaller end of the market. We're mostly running training events and conference-style events. And what we found for the online is we've had some success doing our training. Do some certification training and courses, and they're going well online. We haven't tried to replicate the conferences online, and I'm still not sure. Conferences, exhibitions, how. I mean, obviously people are doing it, and it's a good way to get some income. I'm kind of skeptical from the point of view of if someone's going to sit at home for a weekend in front of a computer, interacting with sessions and networking. I think there may be some aspects of it, but I'm not sure if this is if this is going to be something that survives this COVID period and becomes a regular thing, or if this is just people are trying anything to get by. I'm curious what you think of it, because I'm sure there's something there, but I'm very skeptical of this as being a big thing.
So I would agree with you. I don't think that anybody is attempting to run a virtual exhibition. The virtual exhibitions have been around, or people trying to do them have been around in one form or another for many years, and they've never gained traction. And I don't think that they will gain particular traction now. What people are doing, though, is running webinars, which they're not saying, right. Normally we would be holding this event in the first week of May, and therefore we're having the event online. What they're doing is saying we're running a series of webinars. We've got the speakers who we normally have at our event. We're going to run this. We're getting some, and then going out and getting sponsorship for it. And the number of people who attend these events, because they've got time, because they're at home, because they need to learn in the absence of actually having any events per se. They are the numbers attending these is actually surprisingly large, and allows the organisers to sell sponsorship around them.
Right.
So it's not going to replace the exhibition, and as I said earlier, it's not going to create the same amount of income, but it is a way to cover off overheads. And we've got, there's some interesting stories. We have a client who run investor meets investment events in the mining sector. And they've been, these kind of one-to-one type events in particular lend themselves towards the virtual
Yes.
format. So, whereas you've got the big trade show organisers running webinars and stuff, which is sponsorship, and getting sponsorship in, the people who are running one-to-one events can actually do that online. And what they're finding is that people that they found really difficult to get into their physical events are actually coming to these virtual events, realizing how good they are and how good the investment leads are, and then talking about coming into the physical events when they restart. So it's nice to see some unexpected wins in this. But there is a lot of money around, and there is a lot of thirst for information and for investment leads. So different events will get better traction online than others. But I agree with you. This is not going to herald the rebirth of the virtual event at the demise of the big trade shows.
Yeah, what very interesting. So what's your, obviously if we had a crystal ball it would be great, but we're talking about the near future. So now the summer's kind of out of the question, I guess. We're talking about autumn or fall if you're American, 2020, winter, early 2021. This is not a theoretical thing. It's a real life issue for me. I've got potential events I'm going to be running, It seems to me certain big events have just cancelled. They just said there's no point taking a risk. We'll get out ahead of it. And a lot of smaller and medium ones that, like me, are kind of going ahead and hoping for the best. Is that how you've seen it, or what do you think is the pattern and what's going to happen?
So the pattern, obviously, the starting point back in March, people cancelled all of their events for the first half of the year and pushed them back into the second half of the year. That was what was generally happening. Some people made the decision just to skip this year and hold the event next year. The vast majority pushed them back. And of course, that created a lot of problems with the venues because, it's really hard for the venues to free up enough slots for all of the shows that should take place in the first half of the year into the second half, along with all the events that are scheduled for the second half anyway. And the other issue that people that everybody had as a result of that was increased competition. So events which were competitive or are competitive, but which are separated by 6 months in the calendar, one taking place in March, another taking place in October, suddenly find themselves within a week of each other.
Yeah.
And so that's the first problem. The second problem, of course, is that the exhibitors don't have either the resources or the marketing budgets to support all of the events that they would normally support across a year, to concertina it into a 2 or 3 month period. But those that have already paid for the first half of the year shows, and they're then carrying that money over to the second half, are faced with difficult issues as to which events can they afford to do, which events can they actually do from a resource point of view. So that was the starting point. It was a big mess. Then there was a realization that events in the second half of the year might not happen. And that's kind of the dawning, slow realization which is going on right now, beginning of May as we speak. And obviously people that had events in June have pushed them back. But people who have events in September are starting to make the decision that it's actually too stressful to continue to think about holding all your exhibitors together, particularly if you've managed to get them to a point of accepting a postponed show from March into September, as we see a few people have done. Now, what do you do? How long do you wait until you move that show from September and actually say, you know what, we're not going to run a show at all. We're going to run it in March next year. Because that raises another point, which is when does a postponement become a cancellation? Because you can't really postpone an event for 12 months and call it a postponement. And the whole issue of refunds to exhibitors is completely different based on whether it's a postponed event or a cancellation, then all the terms of trade kick in. So people have been reluctant to think about moving their postponed event from Q4 into 2021 because it becomes a cancellation. So I think that if we try and use a crystal ball, I don't see any big events happening this year. I think that until we have a vaccine, it's going to be very difficult to run a successful event. Science says that if you get 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people in an exhibition hall, then you're going to get the next wave of coronavirus.
Yeah.
So I did read this morning on LinkedIn that Connect, which is a business which Tarsus acquired a couple of years ago, which is one-to-one events, have said that their event in August is definitely going ahead, and that they are implementing social distancing, which is something you can do for one-to-one events. Either the investor meets investment or the buyer meets seller type forums. You can actually use that format quite well. But for the rest of the people running big shows, I just don't see anything happening this year. And I think that most of the organisers are starting to come to terms with that. And privately, the big organisers have been budgeting or forecasting for cash flow purposes on the basis of no events this year and smaller events next year.
Is there a potential issue with, just because of the bigger effects on this, of people just not traveling as much for quite a while, maybe even several years? If you look at things like the mess the airlines are in, so many flights are going to get cancelled. For example, like I live in Prague, that they've already said, I think there's 2 airlines fly to the US from here, like Delta and American. They both said no, there won't be any flights this year. Maybe they won't restart them. They may be just less flights generally, less airlines in existence. Do you think that's a risk, that there just is going to be people just don't travel as much for quite a while?
Massively, yeah, absolutely. So events which are really international are the ones which are going to struggle.
Yeah.
I was talking to one of my former clients. We sold their business about 4 or 5 years ago, and they're still involved in it. And they were talking about, running their show in October. And they get visitors from 121 countries. It's predominantly domestic exhibitors, but it's a massive international buying community. And we were just discussing how can they possibly run that show when people aren't traveling. I think that if we get exhibitions, the first thing is, when can you actually run a show? When a government's going to allow you to run a show? Because you talk about sporting events being held behind closed doors, which is fine. You can do that. You can't run an exhibition behind closed doors, obviously.
Sure.
And social distancing of big exhibitions, and maybe doing what the supermarkets do and allowing a certain number of people in and people having time slots to visit, is probably the way that a lot of events will go, which will make them smaller. Having to have wider gangways to enforce social distancing will mean fewer exhibitors. It will mean fewer visitors. So I think that even for domestic events, you're going to see quite a different type of event in 2021 than we saw in 2019. For those which rely on international exhibitors or visitors, you're absolutely right. People just aren't going to travel. It's going to be too hard to travel. And, who knows when the airlines are going to start back in at the sort of levels that they were at 3-4 months ago.
Yeah, I guess the optimistic viewpoint is that, already like in Austria, they're already starting to have a system where they can potentially test people immediately on arrival, or, you get a test valid within the last few days, and that means you don't have to quarantine. It may be that there's solutions that we don't know yet that get implemented pretty quick, and it gets things moving quicker, because you have to think most governments are desperate for commerce to to keep going, you know. I mean, I guess, but that's obviously, you can't rely on the most optimistic scenario. I mean, the most realistic scenario is the one we've been talking about, I think.
Well, the irony of all of this is actually that everybody's economy has tanked as a result of this, and the single most important thing that could happen to kickstart the economy is having the trade shows. So there's a kind of an irony in the fact that trade shows will probably be prevented from taking place because of the large number of people in a small indoor space, just at a time when you actually need them to counter the negative effects of of what's happening with the economy as a result of all of this.
Definitely. Do you think there's going to be a lot of, like, a very overused term, a new normal, a lot of new normals in terms of events, a lot of temperature checking, a lot of other kind of restrictions, face masks maybe? Do you think these are things that are going to become more common generally?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's really interesting is that, people talk about, in Europe, wearing face masks. I spent a lot of time working in China. I'm quite used to going into an airport and coming out of an airport and going through a temperature check.
Sure.
And having people with face masks on, with a computer, just checking everybody as they come through. And it's absolutely normal and has been for years. And you walk along the streets, and particularly after SARS and so on over in Asia, the number of people wearing face masks, generally is quite high. So I think that it will become the new normal, and it has been normal for a number of years in particularly in Asian countries, and I just think that everybody else is going to have to adopt it. I mean, the technology is there; it's very easy to use, and we're talking about blood tests and so on. That's the tricky bit, because a temperature check normally, do you have a fever? Yes. You get pulled over, and then the next thing in terms of deciding what to do with that person happens. But here, it's with COVID-19, it's a lot more complex than just taking a temperature. So I think that we talk about travel and people having to allow 4 hours to do a blood test and fill in a medical history and all of that kind of stuff. I think that will become the new normal, and I think it will stop a lot of people from traveling. Whether in 5 years' time we'll just have shaken all of this off and we'll be getting on with our lives as we did before, it depends on how quickly we get a vaccine and how effective it is. But that's the only way that the new normal will be the same as the old normal.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned before we started recording is about a lot of large venues for exhibitions have been used as hospitals and stuff, and some issues around that. So do you want to talk quickly about that?
So, there was in the UK, venues like Excel, the NEC, Manchester Central, all agreed to hand over their space to become hospitals, to take some of the weight off the National Health Service and the ICU units in the hospitals, and that was mirrored in other countries. So big venues in Germany were doing the same thing. I think one in Malaysia did the same thing. So one of the issues, and I can't speak for other countries, but particularly in the UK, is there is not a lot of clarity from the government about what will happen longer term with those. Clearly, all of the statistics say that they've hardly been used because the lockdown has meant that the health service has not been overrun. So if you take Excel, they've only got something like 40 patients at a time when they've actually got room for several thousand. but it's not. So there is a bit of uncertainty about what will happen, and whether the government will comply with the deals that they agreed to at the start, which was basically they had use of the venues for 2 months. They had an option to then roll over for another 2 months, and then after that they had to vacate, and everything had to be deep cleaned, and then people could start running events in September. That was the kind of timetable. But you see in the press the idea that maybe with all of the cancelled procedures, non-COVID related procedures that have been, that millions that have had to be cancelled operations, that maybe these venues can play a part in taking some of the strain to get everything back to normal there, which the exhibition industry is looking in horror at. And it's not just as simple as saying, okay, let's take the venue back, let's deep clean it, and let's get back to running exhibitions. There have been millions of pounds spent on the installations to deliver oxygen. All of those millions of pounds of tubing is going to have to be dismantled and dealt with. So you're not going to want to be going in, out. So that's the problem with the venues, that it costs quite a lot of money to set them up as hospitals. It'll also cost quite a lot of money to decommission them as hospitals. So it's not just a straightforward decision saying, okay, you can run your shows in September, but if we have a second surge because the lockdown the release of the lockdown was too sudden, so we want it back as a hospital. That isn't the sort of thing that can just happen overnight. So it's just another added complication to what is already a very, very difficult scenario for everybody.
Sure. Steve, really interesting chat as always. I guess to end it on a positive note, I guess we both see that, there is going to be an end to this, and obviously, especially people who are maybe just starting, it's obviously probably picked the worst time in history, but it is going to end, there is going to be live events and in a few years, we'll look back on this time as just, a tragedy, but things are now normal,
Yeah. I think logic tells you that that's the case, but this came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
We just don't know what is going to happen next. And as I say, the absolute key thing here is not lockdown, release of lockdown, strategies for releasing lockdown. It's actually a vaccine. Yeah. Because unless and until you get an effective vaccine, this is always going to be around us, and there's always going to have to be social distancing, which will then affect our industry more than most.
For sure. Steve, thanks very much to talk. We'll definitely catch up again, I'm sure, soon and have some updates. How can people get in touch with you if they need to?
We've got a lot of information which we share on a regular basis. We have created the Event Entrepreneurs Club, and we have a dedicated email address, which is eeclub@mayfieldmerger.com. And people can contact us there. We're about to put out a document which UFI, the Global Association, published yesterday for steps for the re-establishment of the exhibition industry. So as and when we get useful information, we disseminate it through the club, and we are always available to talk one-to-one with people to share our experiences, because we talk to all of the major players, we talk to all of the independents, and what we encourage through the club is the sharing of experiences and information. So people can get in touch with us through eeclub@mayfieldmerger.com.
Great. Steve, pleasure to chat. Thanks for your time, and best of luck with your business and to everyone you work with.
Thank you, and you too. Speak to you soon.